was the middle of a hot, muggy summer when Chickasaw men, women, elders, and children, their wagons and livestock, lined up to board a Mississippi River steamship, wearing their finest, bringing everything they could carry, but leaving behind so much more. The journey that had started in June reached the river crossing on July 4th, 1837, a day that commemorates the birth of a new United States nation, but also the end of an era for the Chickasaw Nation in its cherished homeland east of the Mississippi River, and the beginning of a journey into the unknown. The story of Chickasaw removal begins decades before the wagons were loaded and the first steps were taken to the forced removal. America, a young fledgling country, was experiencing a rapidly growing population, expanding borders, and special interests vying for power and wealth set a series of events into motion.
To understand the backstory to Chickasaw removal, you have to go back into the 1700s, in the time period after the rise of the United States of America in 1776, and then solidified in 1783, and President Washington, whose Indian policy was one of trade and mutual defense and friendship.
Chickasaw leaders Tishominko, George Colbert, Tishominko, among others, cultivated beneficial relationships with the new United States and President George Washington that would later serve the Chickasaw people well as the influx of Europeans began to chip away at land boundaries and traditional culture.
In the century of the 1700s, our society and our culture was turned upside down. There was a turn that was made in our society. The knowledge of traditional skills, traditional ways of doing things, traditional techniques was beginning to fade away.
In the face of these challenges, Chickasaw people persevered by adopting ideas and technologies that were useful to them and rejecting those that were not. They adapted to European trade and business practices by acquiring language skills they needed to interact with English-speaking traders and leaders. Chickasaw ancestors maintained their cultural identity while replacing old materials with new materials.
English early entered Chickasaw Nation as a medium of trade. And it wasn't until later when the children of the Colberts and the Kemps and the Loves, for example, the second generation, began to learn English as a second language, and sometimes even a third language. It was an important skill, especially in terms of treaty negotiations, understanding the ways of Euro-Americans. A lot of these skills would assist us later at removal.
Tribal leaders foresaw that the Americans would inevitably push westward, encroaching on tribal territory. Thomas Jefferson set the gears of removal in motion with a strategy to take tribal land inch by inch. His original concept to address the Indian problem was through Western civilization and education, including Christianization, that would later culminate in Andrew Jackson removing the tribal nations west of the Mississippi River.
Andrew Jackson was very much a man of action. There was a certain brutality to the policies he advocated and implemented. Thomas Jefferson was much more cerebral, and I would say with tribal relations, much more backhanded.
The idea of removal really started with Thomas Jefferson when he was president. They were anticipating the possibility of getting the Louisiana Purchase, and he sent a message to Congress about, that this would be a good thing to consider, a place for the tribes to be removed.
It had to do with the rapid growth of population in the young United States and the thirst for land. With the death of Washington in 1799, there was a change in Indian policy, with President Jefferson particularly initiating the dual strategy of, quote, civilization through agents and through trade to draw tribes into debt.
He created an elaborate plan and outlined it to indebt the southeastern tribes, to force land exchange treaties, to diminish the land base, eventually leading to the expulsion of the southeastern tribes.
Early on, the Chickasaw Nation homeland was seen as a prized possession for land speculators and colonizers.
It was known to have very rich soil in the river valleys and really almost everywhere in terms of rainfall and soil fertility. So it had to do with the rise of the cotton economy. The rapid rise of cotton exports to Britain, the price of cotton drove land speculators to work toward Indian removal. You had Wall Street investment firms that were fomenting for Indian removal because of the investments that they could make in land speculation and in cotton agriculture, that they felt that they could get rich quick in doing so.
United States independence from Great Britain's rule didn't end the quest for European countries to seek opportunities in North America. Both Great Britain and Spain had their eyes on areas to plant their flags. Spain envisioned tribes as a buffer between its ambitions and hoped they would oppose expansion of the United States. So it cultivated an alliance and trade with Chickasaw leader Oglayankabi. At the same time, Tishominko had forged a friendship with President Washington, all while the influx of Euro-Americans continued moving west.
Tishominko had come to learn that a piece of paper that described your land that was called a title, and that was the legal basis of your ownership of your land. And he wanted to establish a title for Chickasaw Nation, for the Chickasaw land. And so he described the boundaries of Chickasaw Nation by reference to the major rivers and mountain ranges and drainage divides, and he had that written down by the U.S. officials beginning in 1786 at the Hopewell Treaty. He had it renewed in 1794, and he had it signed by President Washington. And it was, as he believed, a title to the Chickasaw Nation's land.
The boundaries, recognized and validated by President Washington, would provide leverage in later treaties.
Military alliances with the tribes were key to colonial success in that early period. And so Chickasaws, in those early years, they had certain Minkos who would go befriend the colonial leaders of the French, and others the British. And so this decentralized geopolitics allowed the Chickasaws to be taken for granted by no one and sort of courted by everyone. And so that was a successful strategy that allowed Chickasaws to not only survive but thrive.
Tribal relations with the new United States government was murky at best in the beginning, with states acting as free agents handling federal Indian policy, with an ongoing thirst for land.
Trying to ethnically cleanse a region of the country from groups of peoples that had lived there since time immemorial was far messier than the original founders had understood. And the United States, as the federal government, dragged its feet, and state governments began to take matters into their own hands.
The Cherokee and Creek in particular were being harassed by settlers moving west from the Carolinas and Georgia. Chickasaws were not suffering like the Cherokees and Creeks were from that encroachment, but leaders knew that it was just a matter of time.
When Spain left in 1796, that ended the alliance with Wolfe's friend, leaving Tishominko and other Chickasaw leaders with a higher profile in the tribe, thanks to their relationship with the current sole political power, the United States.
As more and more Europeans came into the Chickasaw communities and settlements, we really began to see a major change in the way that the United States federal government, the state of Mississippi, and the Europeans looked at our homelands.
The emergence of new leadership in both the United States and Chickasaw Nation created challenges, but the Chickasaw people remained united.
Chickasaw leadership really started to change in the early 1800s, and this is because the Chickasaw National Council votes to make George Colbert a principal chief, consolidating power into a single high official, which is different than the previous leadership division between civil leaders and military leaders.
The first treaty in which the Chickasaws gave something up was the 1801 Treaty of Chickasaw Bluffs, which was negotiated and signed at present-day Memphis.
The Treaty of Chickasaw Bluffs opened Chickasaw land for the building of a highway called the Natchez Trace, connecting Natchez to Nashville, shrewdly negotiated by George Colbert, with a stipulation that all businesses, including stands or inns, had to be operated by Chickasaws.
They would buy food from Chickasaws and lodging. And so this started the hospitality industry. Chickasaws would move to the road and host settlers, host travelers in their homes, feed them for a fee. And so it was a source of income.
During this time, Chickasaw communities were thriving. But not long after the 1801 treaty, Jefferson's strategy to gain land through indebtedness began to take shape in damaging ways.
1805 was the first land cession by Chickasaw Nation to the United States, and that treaty was to address debt. Some $80,000 to $100,000 of debt to trading houses had been accumulated by Chickasaws, and there was also friction between settlers in Tennessee and North Alabama encroaching on Chickasaw land. Basically, the land where white squatters were already settled on Chickasaw land, that's what they gave up in 1805.
Increasingly, Americans were illegally entering Chickasaw Nation and squatting, creating homesteads, growing crops. Illegal traders were an issue. American trade goods, American alcohol, any number of things that were illegal by tribal law were increasingly entering Chickasaw Nation.
Another complication after the formation of the United States, there was no defined western border for the original colonies, now states, and there was an ongoing power struggle between states and the federal government.
So there were strings being pulled and backroom deals in Congress to establish these states. And Andrew Jackson was primarily a land speculator, as so many men were back then. And West Tennessee was the apple of his eye, so to speak. He really wanted to get West Tennessee from the Chickasaws.
Andrew Jackson was also making a name for himself on the battlefield.
Andrew Jackson, being from the South, was pro-removal from the start. There wasn't any question about that.
In the War of 1812, the British captured and burned Washington, D.C., but that didn't end the war. We all know now that they landed in New Orleans and were grievously defeated by Andrew Jackson and everybody in New Orleans who could hold a gun, including Choctaws and a few Chickasaws.
But those loyalties didn't mean much to Andrew Jackson. He always opted for political expediency.
And as history has taught over and over in stories of conflict, money and greed was a major contributing factor and motivator. Andrew Jackson was a businessman who saw an opportunity for a ferry crossing on the Mississippi River. In 1817, he was involved in the founding of Memphis as a land speculator and a politician seeking to enrich himself with land sales.
We remember him most for the betrayal when we helped him in the War of 1812 against the Red Sticks in 1814 and 15, and potentially against the British, and then still suffered the Indian Removal Act 15 years later. Andrew Jackson, he had in fact had plotted to frame the Chickasaws as hostiles in the War of 1812 and attack them and take the land by the sword instead of by the pen. And so he was not able to do that, though, because George Colbert outmaneuvered him by writing letters to the newspapers in Knoxville and declaring that the Chickasaws were ready to fight on behalf of the United States. They then asked the Chickasaws for West Tennessee. George Colbert and the other Chickasaw leaders refused, and they presented Commissioner Andrew Jackson with the certificate to the title to Chickasaw Nation, which surprised him and angered him.
The Chickasaw Nation ceded a small amount of land in the treaty with the U.S. and Chickasaw of 1816, also known as the Treaty of the Chickasaw Council House. This resistance from the Chickasaws enabled them to keep West Tennessee and received annuities from the United States. The strategy of appeasement, alliance, and politics with the Americans during this time worked much better for the Chickasaws than the United States could have thought. About this time, Levi Colbert rose to a position of authority.
He was an extremely good businessman and was able to negotiate with the United States on a new level that allowed us to get these favorable treaty agreements at a very critical time that made a huge difference to our future in Indian Territory. Around this time, we also see a new leadership title that's introduced as a district chief. To make it easier for U.S. officials, they divided the Chickasaw homeland into 4 districts. So in 1818, we have Samuel Seeley, William McGilvery, Tishominko, and Apasantubby as district leaders. They were responsible for disseminating information to Chickasaws within their districts.
After Mississippi extended its lands over the Chickasaw territory, the whole thing changed.
You had the Chickasaw Nation that was, by the founding of Mississippi statehood, I mean, they were surrounded, in essence, by the state. And if we attempted to enforce our own tribal laws on non-tribal citizens, as Tishominko was doing, it created a great deal of challenges for us, principally because the United States was failing in its trust responsibilities to enforce our laws and their own laws in Mississippi.
In fact, Tishominko was jailed trying to enforce Chickasaw laws, so it became apparent there was no legal protection for Chickasaw people.
Because the press of the people of the settlements that just kept going, and the press of the settlements was what eventually just brought everybody to the point saying, okay, we've just got to do this.
Monroe County was the first one to extend its authority over the entire Chickasaw Nation. And then the other counties were formed, and then, of course, people were subject to the laws of the county and the state.
1818, the United States soon came back, less than 2 years after their Treaty of 1816, wanting more land. And there was more debt that had accrued by this time, and more settlers, squatters. And so Chickasaw Nation was forced to sell West Tennessee. So Jackson finally got his plum of West Tennessee.
When Jackson was running for president, he knew that that push from all the settlers was really tough, and he was ready to do something. And he knew the players, he knew what it would take. He went to Congress and made this plea for a removal treaty.
Against all odds, the Chickasaw people and their leadership demonstrated considerable resolve and did not give up.
They were very good negotiators. In fact, that was one of the things that I found really remarkable in the study of all of those treaty negotiations, is that the Chickasaws were excellent negotiators.
But it was George and Levi and younger James who became the Colbert leaders, and they were very much involved in a lot of negotiations, very much so. And Jackson knew them, he knew their personalities, and they knew his personalities. They knew how far they could push him, and he got very frustrated in all those negotiations.
The settlers in the state of Mississippi were making it clear that Chickasaw Nation could no longer persist in its homeland. Chickasaws would be defrauded, they would be harassed, murdered.
If you decide to stay and the settlers come in and they burn down your crops and they move into your houses, you can't retaliate. If you decide not to leave, you have to become a member of the state of Mississippi. And with that, our ancestors and leaders knew that we would not be able to stay, and were unified as one to leave to Indian Territory. No matter how traumatic and how terrible it was, we had to go.
During James Monroe's presidency, a new plan was embraced to weaken tribal culture and communities.
The American Civilization Plan was part of the U.S. federal government's federal Indian policy, and the goal was to assimilate Chickasaw people and other southeastern tribes to Euro-American ways of life. And essentially what this meant was having Chickasaws practice European styles of land ownership, private property, commercial agricultural practices.
You had the Civilization Act of 1819, which funded schools. They saw the benefit of having a literate and English-speaking educated generation of Chickasaws, and they saw that that was going to be necessary to continue as the nation was being surrounded by settlers. The plan of civilization was executed through Indian agents that were assigned to each tribe, and that provided advice and funding and technology such as looms and plows and blacksmith operations to encourage tribes to adopt row crop farming, livestock raising, things that they were doing already to some extent, but on a broader scale, to bring about this so-called ideal of civilization to tribes, and at the same time whittle away their lands through drawing tribes into debt through that trade for goods, and then satisfy those debts with Indian land.
The Chickasaws had a good deal of respect for the leadership. There was a very strong sense of unity in the Chickasaw people at the time, but they were becoming demoralized by what was happening around them with all of this traffic in and out. And of course, they had been beset by Americans even before the removal question was debated strongly, because no fences on the border lines. Tennesseans particularly were relaying livestock into the Chickasaw Nation. Some of them were even coming across the line and putting in crops. And then, of course, whiskey peddlers were coming into the Chickasaw country.
That leads us into the 1820s, where you had another attempt in 1826 to call a treaty to get the rest of the land, but the Chickasaws refused to meet. And then in 1827, Thomas McKinney, the Secretary of Indian Affairs, traveled down to Chickasaw Nation by water and carriage to visit his old friend, Levi Colbert, who was principal chief after his brother George. Levi and McKinney were old friends, and McKinney wanted to make sure Levi understood that Indian removal was a wave that was about to sweep over the South, and that there was not going to be any resisting it. McKinney had information that the Indian Removal Act was being drafted, and so he wanted to make sure that Chickasaws did not end up in a situation where they were removed at bayonet point by the U.S. Army. And so that is when the Chickasaws first agreed to go look for land out west. And so a party went out west for months looking at the land here. And they did that several times.
By the time he took office, it was apparent on the part of the federal government that definite policies had to be developed related to American Indians. And by the time he took office, lines of debate had already formed. And there were two lines of thought. One was based in the northern states primarily, and with missionaries and reformers. And that idea was that the tribe should be assimilated and acculturated and brought into American society at large. The other side of that was that they should be moved out of the way of the American population, which was really expanding by that time.
He made a presidential message to Congress, December of 1829.
We are here today to pass the Indian Removal Act. This act will ensure and guarantee the prosperity of these United States.
The whole controversy with the southern states was laid before Congress with his advice for action. That's when he did that, because Mississippi had become a state just a year or two before, and they had impressed their laws on the Chickasaws, and we were reacting hard to that.
When Andrew Jackson ran for office, he ran for president on the removal ticket. And his first State of the Union in 1829, he asked for a removal bill to be passed by Congress.
He wrote letters soon after he assumed office, and he wrote that you must go west. We are going to pass a law called the Indian Removal Act, and I'm going to sign it, and you're going to be removed. So if you want to do so on your own, now is the time. And of course, tribes rejected this. Many politicians in the northeastern states were opposed to this policy, and some of the southern politicians were opposed. Particularly a man named David Crockett was very opposed to the cruel and unjust Indian Removal Act because he had known Chickasaws for decades. He had fought alongside Chickasaws in the War of 1812. He had traded with Chickasaws, camped and hunted with Chickasaws. He was friend and neighbor of Chickasaws. And so he argued vehemently against the Indian Removal Act on the floor of Congress in 1830. But he was a man of principle in that respect, and he was rewarded for that with the loss of his election, his next election.
And after a most acrimonious debate, Congress passed the Act of May 1830, declaring a federal policy favorable to the removal of the Indians, and placed in the hands of President Jackson the power to initiate the necessary steps to secure exchanges of lands with any tribe residing within the limits of the states or otherwise.
And it was a very close vote. The Senate was 28-19, and the House was 101-97. So those are very close votes. Bill passed on the 26th of May. He signed it on the 28th of May, 1830, and removal then was federal law.
In late August 1830, a delegation of Chickasaw leaders traveled to Franklin, Tennessee, and to meet with the U.S. Secretary of War, John Eaton, and U.S. official John Coffey to negotiate a removal treaty.
The treaty process for the Chickasaw Nation leading up to the removal treaties was quite complicated, and many sort of caveats or backdoors out were put into these treaties. For example, the Chickasaw said, fine, we'll remove, but if we don't find satisfactory land to the west, it's null and void. So it was very clear from the outset that Chickasaw Nation leadership, including some of my own ancestors, were vehemently opposed to removal.
There were some who were supposed to be friends of the Chickasaws, were actually partners in land companies and were working on behalf of the federal government. And they tried to create a division among the Chickasaw negotiators between Levi, Colbert, and others.
In some cases, John Coffey, for example, was really offering overt bribes to convince tribal leadership to stop this. Let's sign this treaty and get this process going. And Levi Colbert was deeply committed to the Chickasaw Nation and to the values of that nation.
Our leadership was able to focus on what can we get out of this if we're going to have to go. And as a consequence, they just kept asking more and asking more and asking more. And they kept getting more and more and more consideration before removal, promises made in terms of money and land.
When you go back and see the transcriptions of these early removal treaty negotiations, what you really see is our ancestors using just really powerful rhetorical devices to argue against the United States' effort to remove us. Like comparing the Chickasaw Nation to an ancient tree that, if uprooted and removed, would only die.
Chickasaw leaders ended up signing the 1830 treaty with the U.S., known as the Treaty of Franklin, with that unique clause that they would only remove if they found suitable land in the West, a key point that protected their interests.
Ultimately, that trip was unsuccessful, and we did not find land, and so that treaty, the Treaty of Franklin from 1830, was null and void, and it was never ratified by the U.S. Congress.
In 1832, the tribe said, fine, we recognize and we choose not to live among this great evil, and we want to remove ourselves as a nation so we can continue as a nation in lands suited to our way of life.
You had people like Levi Colbert, who was stepping in and negotiating treaties, and he stood in the way of the United States government, effectively and quickly and efficiently negotiating these treaties.
The United States was very persistent, and they came back in the fall of 1832 in the treaty with the U.S. and Chickasaw, known as the Treaty of Pontotoc Creek, and presented an agreement the Chickasaws could not get out of. With their backs against the wall and putting their people first, Chickasaw leaders signed it.
And it really wasn't until the death of Levi Colbert, who was one of the main negotiators of these treaties, that everything fell away.
The death of Levi Colbert came at an unopportune time. He was supposed to go with a delegation to Washington, D.C. to work on the Supplemental Treaty of 1834, but he was too ill to do that.
And this really creates a leadership vacuum in the Chickasaw Nation.
I think that had Levi not passed away during the middle of these treaty negotiations, I don't think for a minute that we could have avoided it. because remaining in our homeland meant that we ceased to exist as a tribal government. We could continue as people, but we would all be subject to the laws of the state of Mississippi.
It was not going to be possible for Chickasaw Nation to persist in its original homeland. If it was going to survive as a nation, sovereign, with cultural identity, they were going to have to go somewhere else. And that's the agonizing decision the leaders had to make.
So the Chickasaw Commission that was created with the Supplemental Treaty of 1834 starts to fill that leadership void. There are 7 men, and it is Ishtahodapa, our highest civil leader at the time. You have Levi Colbert originally, his son Martin Colbert, George Colbert, Isaac Alberson, Henry Love, and Benjamin Love. Once Levi passes away, Major James Colbert, who is Levi's youngest brother, he takes his position. And this group of men are the ones that are in control of the Chickasaw removal funds. What was unique about our treaties is we received money for our land versus land for land. And in order to facilitate that, reserves had to be issued to each Chickasaw. And so with the Supplemental Treaty of 1834, where our leaders were able to correct some of the issues they had with the Treaty of Pontotoc in 1832, we were almost ready to start issuing those reserves.
All the people in the tribe were given reservations, the same as allotments. They had a choice of either staying in Mississippi and not removing, or if they did decide to remove, they could sell those properties. And there were a lot of sales that went on. So individually, a lot of, not just the leadership, but a lot of the tribal members got a pretty good chunk of money from their sales.
In all the negotiations, one of the things they insisted on was that they had control of their own funds. It was understood that they would remove themselves, and they would pay for it. None of the other tribes did that.
The issue of where to remove continued to be an obstacle, even as Chickasaws steadfastly held off on leaving their homeland.
And so what they did was to send a commission to the Choctaws to meet with them and discuss joining the Choctaw Nation as the government had originally wanted, or find some other place suitable. Those were the negotiators that met with the Choctaws at Dokesville. It went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for several times, and then finally they came to agreement that the Chickasaw District would be established on the western part of the Choctaw country.
The Chickasaw Nation did not buy land from the Choctaw Nation. Chickasaw Nation paid $530,000 in order to obtain all of the rights under the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. And Choctaw insisted on that in large part because they had negotiated the deal with the feds.
It would have the same authority in the National Council and be equal to each district of the Choctaw Nation. Chickasaws would be subject to Choctaw law, but the Chickasaws could retain control of their financial affairs, and that laid the groundwork then for the establishment in the 1850s of the Chickasaw Nation.
Challenges began all over after the signing of the removal treaty. Violence against the Chickasaw people didn't end with the stroke of a pen.
And of course, what they were leaving was everything familiar to them. Family, neighbors, systems of economics, seasons, which varied from area to area, and of course, leaving the graves of their ancestors. Leaving what, since time immemorial to them, had been home.
Enshrined in the United States Constitution is this idea that treaties are the law of the land. And when the United States government made promises to our ancestors, they said, as we exchanged this land for another, which we were really vehemently against, they said, you'll have these lands for as long as the grass grows and the water runs. And unfortunately, that just proved to be another lie.
It was a tragic and cruel process. Part of that is the individual experiences of the Chickasaw leaders, and also the fact that they operated by consensus. They deliberated all of these topics among themselves, and they arrived at the best prospect for Chickasaw people. It's inspiring that they all stayed together. They didn't fragment and split like some tribes did. Chickasaws are the only tribe of the 5 that don't have a homeland version or a homeland remnant. There is no Mississippi band of Chickasaws. They all stayed together and left together.
It was a terrible experience for all the people, but I think also, and we use this term all the time, it was a journey of survival.
Standing on the banks of the Mississippi on that fateful day of July 4th, 1837, it's easy to picture a range of emotions, dread and anxiety over the removal ahead, filled with challenges and potential danger, but facing the unknown together with a glimmer of hope. The unconquered and unconquerable Chickasaw Nation stepped into a new chapter to be continued in Indian Territory as a united sovereign nation with its cultural identity intact.
Pumalskania kio.